Go ahead and open your Bibles to Acts 17, the book of Acts chapter 17. I want to use a key statement that Paul made there to kind of prepare us for what I want to share during this session regarding our local community, reaching across the street and around the world. We've kind of talked about around the world, and forgive me for my voice. I was in Nevada all week with my mom. My mom was put on hospice a week ago, and so I was up at my brother's house spending time with my mom, and it's really dry air up there, and that dry air just tortures my throat nowadays. So I'm going to go as long as I can. Carlos is going to bring me some tea, but I apologize for the gravel voice that you're hearing. So what I want to do before we launch into this final session and look at local engagement and what God is doing in our own neighborhoods, I want to kind of use an analogy. How many of you are former Navy? Any former Navy guys in here? Okay. So, yay! All right, I was Army. That's okay. You Navy guys are okay. One of the analogies that the Lord gave me years ago as I was in San Diego looking at one of the carriers, I think it was the Carl Vinson that was stationed in San Diego at the time, was the idea of a local church being an aircraft carrier in the mission and purposes of God. And if you think about the purpose of an aircraft carrier, it is to carry aircraft. And as I pondered that analogy, I noticed that a couple things. Number one, an aircraft carrier has a purpose. It's to carry aircraft. But the crew of a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, which is what most of the carriers that you guys are familiar with, it's called a Nimitz class, they're nuclear. The amount of people on that ship when it's deployed is 5,500 people. Each aircraft carrier has the capacity to carry 90 fixed-wing aircraft. So an aircraft carrier, the maximum number of planes that it can carry are 90 fixed-wing aircraft in a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. It is to project American power. It's under the control of the commander-in-chief, and the idea is to project American power anywhere on the planet, ultimately to protect American citizens. And part of the idea is to engage the enemy as far from the shores of America as possible. And so what you have to understand about these aircraft carriers, though, is, the crew is it takes 5,400 people to launch 90 aircraft. So any aircraft carrier carries a group of pilots of about 120 pilots that can fly those 90 planes. Everybody else is on the ship. And the ship is broken down into two categories. There's the ship's crew, which is the crew that makes the ship go, maintains the engines, does everything, the ship's crew, the cooks, the laundry, electricians, and all that stuff. And then there's the air wing. So the ship's crew is about 2,800 people. It takes 2,800 people to float a ship and make it function. It takes another 2,400 people to fly those planes and maintain the planes and put weapons on them and keep the planes intact. Thank you, brother. I'm doing a little honey with tea. And he took that order, so he'll be back. But here's what I want you to see. That's a good analogy for a local church and global mission. See, the aircraft carrier, the captain of the ship doesn't leave the ship. He captains the ship. And those 5,500 people that are the crew, everybody has a role to play, and every role matters. Right? The cooks have to cook. If the cooks don't cook food that doesn't make the crew sick, then you're going to have a pilot who can't accomplish the ultimate mission of engaging the enemy because he's got an upset stomach. He's got diarrhea. He can't respond when the call comes in to launch the aircraft. Everybody has a role to play, and every role matters. And the guys that I knew that are in the Navy say that the difference in one carrier to another is the captain and the XO, the executive officer. If the captain and the XO aren't very good at communicating to the crew, you matter. You plumbers, you guys that do the laundry, you cooks, you guys that bosun's mates, I think they're called, that sand the rust off the boat. Everybody's got a role to play, and every role matters to accomplish the mission. If the captain keeps the mission in front of the whole crew and all of you matter, not just the pilots. The pilot can't engage the enemy out there if his plane doesn't fly, if he's not in good health, if his uniform is dirty and he's squirming in his seat. So everything you do matters. So when the crew is tempted to think what I'm doing is monotonous, it's mundane. The key to being monotonous and to removing things from the mundane is to keep the mission in front of everybody. You all have a role to play, and your role matters. And without your role, we can't do the mission that God has given us to do. So the pilots are like missionaries that God calls from the local church to go. Their ability to go and accomplish the mission hinges on everybody back here. And the ratio on an aircraft carrier, which I think is a good ratio, in the hundreds of churches that I've taught this stuff to and trained and so forth, is, the ratio on an aircraft carrier is 55-1. For every one missionary, one pilot that engages the enemy, it takes 55 people doing their jobs to accomplish that task. And so it is in the local church. That's a good ratio. So every 55 to 60 people in a local church, there should be somebody being called to go to the field. And when that person's called to go to the field, there's an opportunity for the body to send them in a manner worthy of God. So it's a pretty cool little analogy that years later people have told me, man, I still remember that aircraft carrier analogy. And again, the key is that 55 people on the back lines are necessary for the one guy to be successful out there. But everybody is engaged in accomplishing the mission, and everybody is contributing at some level. And you probably already heard the analogy, the difference between a cruise ship and a Navy ship, right? A cruise ship, everybody getting on board that cruise ship except the crew is there to self-serve. You've heard, if I've been on cruises, some of you have been on cruises, you get on as a passenger, you get off as cargo because there's so much food, nonstop eating. So a cruise ship, and a lot of times churches are cruise ships. The people that come to a church are like passengers on a cruise ship. They're here for what we can get, what we can eat. It's all about the staff serving me, the people serving me. Versus every person on board a Navy ship is on board that ship because they have all made the decision that I want to be part of something larger than my own interests, and I don't get on board to be served. I'm getting on board to contribute to the mission. So churches should be Navy ships, aircraft carriers. We're not cruise ships. But a lot of people want cruise ships. And that's how the church has accommodated them many times over the years. But churches that we're on a mission from God locally and internationally, then the people that are on board here, you're not going to be comfortable if you're looking for a cruise ship environment. This is not a cruise ship, right? You're only going to last so long. And then you're going to find some other church because we're on a mission from God here. The Blues Brothers stole our line. We're on a mission from God, right? Okay? And the Navy has different slogans, right, over the years. The Navy has different slogans, the different armed forces. When I went in the Army, it was, the slogan for the Army was, be all that you can be, Army. And then there was this stupid one, be an army of one, which makes absolutely no sense. But to this culture, so one of the Navy slogans a couple years ago was a global force for good. So the Blues Brothers and the Navy took slogans from the church. We're on a mission from God and we're a global force for good, and they ripped us off. and we want them back. Okay? We're going to take them back. So, all right, so we're going to talk now about some of what hopefully is going to unfold over the next few months with me being here and being able to help out. And that's this reality that I want to unpack a little bit more of ethnicity. The idea that every ethnic group and language was God's design before he created. So, language distinction, ethnicity, was not the result of sin. It was God's design from the beginning. Sin is the mechanism he chose to bring it into reality because he is sovereign. And so, along those lines, it's important for us to understand that bigger picture. And I have you in Acts 17 because Paul understood this, and when he was in Athens at the Areopagus, which was like the think tank of that day, the philosophers were there, the influencers, the people that you might say would train university professors. What was being taught in the universities came from the Areopagus in Athens. And as Paul is given this incredible opportunity to speak to them, and he goes into that whole text there in Acts 17, which could be weeks of study. It's phenomenal what he says. Is he comes to this key point, and in Acts 17, verse 26, he notices all the gods that are being worshipped in their images, and notice his approaches. You're a bunch of idol-serving heathens, and I'm going to go around and knock over all your statues. No, he sees all the images, and he finds one on-ramp. Hey, you guys are very religious. See, he fans the flames of their spirituality. He says, yeah, you are spiritual. You are going to worship. The evidence of you being true worshipers is all around me with these images. In fact, you even have an image over here to the unknown God. So notice he doesn't condemn their religiosity. He looks within their religiosity and its expressions to find an on-ramp to build on, to introduce them to the true and the living God who hardwired them to worship. Every person is hardwired to worship. The challenge is, who are they worshiping? And sin has caused people to worship everything but the true and the living God. So he says in Acts 17, this God who I'm introducing to you, well, let me look at verse 25. He's not served by human hands as though he needed anything. He himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made, now listen, this God made from one man, one common source, every ethnic group of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. So listen to Paul's theology. Listen to Paul's missiology. Listen to Paul's anthropology. Humanity exists in different ethnicities. From one common source, he's made all ethnic groups. So he's introducing the idea that, and again, linguists validate this, all known languages on the planet can be traced back to one common source. As incredibly diverse as that is, and I don't understand linguistics, but that's what science has proven. These guys, smart guys, have come up with that. But the idea is, Paul says, listen, from one original source, the ethnic diversity and all the languages that are on the planet were God's design. And notice what he says. He says, he made from one man every ethnic group of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods. So Paul's saying every ethnic group has appeared in the history of humanity at a certain moment in time that God designed for it to appear. There's nothing haphazard here. There's nothing random. Every distinct, like 300 years ago, there were no Americans. Americans didn't exist as we know Americans. The country didn't exist. But this group of people, this ethnic group that we know as Americans, by God's design, was to come on the scene in human history at that moment in time. And so Paul he's laying this concept down, which we need to understand, that and languages rise and fall. You know, some languages are just extinct now. And that's a whole nother subject to get into, that fascinating of languages that have passed on in ethnic groups that have merged with other ethnic groups, and there's no pure ones left, you might say, anymore. Well, nobody's ultimately pure anyway, because we all trace ourselves back to the three sons of Noah, right? And Noah himself, you might say. So, but the point of it is predetermine their times in the history. And not only that, the boundaries of their dwelling place. So God's plan is when an ethnic linguistic group comes onto the scene in human history and where they are primarily located, the bulk of that people group, what location they're at. So whether that's Vietnam, whether that's China, whether that's, the Peruvian Andes, whether that's Cameroon, God has predetermined the ethnic groups, the language groups, when they would come on the scene and where they would dwell primarily as a group of people. Okay, so these are really important concepts to understand. And especially as we start looking at our neighborhoods, how God has sovereignly orchestrated bringing people from every ethnic group, almost every ethnic group. He's moving them around the world. Wars are a tool that he uses to move people around, to get them to places where they have access to truth that they may not have had in their own country. So yet you want to view what's happening through that lens of the sovereignty of God and all things moving toward his end game plan, which again, Revelation 5, Revelation 7, is people from every tribe, people, nation, and tongue worshiping Jesus. Now, a couple of other things to keep in mind. When Jesus gave the Great Commission, the two really good ones that are just jam-packed are the Matthew 28, 19 and 20, and then the Luke 24, 43 to 45 texts. The basic concept is you, church, are to go and beginning at Jerusalem, preach repentance and forgiveness of sins in my name to all ethnic groups, beginning here. Go and make disciples of all the nations. And at the time Jesus gave that commission, of course, you didn't have travel like you have today, international travel. It was like you walked or you took a boat or whatever. But the idea is that original Great Commission, to gather people in to be worshipers of Jesus, you had to go to where they were at. Somebody had to receive the calling of God and be obedient to it, to act like Abraham, leave your family, leave your friends, leave everything familiar and comfortable, and go to this faraway place to represent the true and the living God, kind of like Joseph. And it's going to be difficult. You're detached from people you know, everything comfortable. That's been the history of missions. And the history of missions has unfolded. It's interesting over the years. It's a big subject, but the bottom line is that was the original commission, was for the church to go. One fascinating way of looking at the Old Testament versus the New. The old vehicle, Israel, versus the new vehicle, the church. The Old Testament concept was the call for God's people to know him and serve him and him to be in their midst in a certain geographic location, and the call was for the nations to come. So Solomon prayed, when the stranger or foreigner comes here, built into the laws, when the stranger or foreigner come here, you embrace them, you serve them, you love them, so that they come to know me. The call was to come. And there's a term for outward forces that go towards a center point. It's called centripetal, or centripetal, P-E-T-A-L, centripetal. And that's the idea of external forces coming together towards a center point. That's the Old Testament methodology that God used, calling the nations to come. But when Jesus comes, when the missionary God comes, he changes the methodology. And instead of calling the nations to come, he says, you're now the temple of God. There's no temple. Doesn't exist. We don't need it anymore. We never did, ultimately. Well, we did for the right purposes. But you are the temple of the true and the living God. And instead of calling the nations to come to the temple, he calls to the temples, you are to go to the nations. It's a centrifugal force. You old guys, they don't do this anymore because it would be child abuse. But back in the day, at playgrounds, at least in California, we had these things that spun around, right? And you're spinning that thing. There's centrifugal force. It's throwing you outward. We love to get our friends out there and push them to the middle and then spin them real fast and watch them fly off of this thing. I mean, that's what we did, right? It's a centrifugal force, a center point with force flying outward. That's the call of the church. The church is not called to attract people to come. The church is called to go. And the temple of God needs to be in your insurance office. You are the temple of God. It's on the police force because you're on the police force. It's at your school because you're at your school. So the New Testament model is the church, the temple, goes and engages where people are at. And so that was the call. Now it's interesting, fascinating to me that in Acts 2:9, when the church is birthed, it's multi-ethnic. You can look up later Acts 2:9, where it's describing the day of Pentecost and the Holy Spirit fell, and it gives a list of the people that were in there and heard them speaking in tongues, languages that were not their own. And it was people, Jews from all over that were in Jerusalem at the time, both Jews and proselytes. So there were non-Jews who were followers of the God of Israel that were gathered in Israel. And the day of Pentecost, when the church, as we know it, is birthed, it's multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, the day of its birth. Okay, so everybody tracking with me so far? So the commission was to go, and that commission is still there because there are still people in countries under governments that have no access to the gospel. If they got up tomorrow morning and wanted to find the true and the living God, there's nobody in their city that knows him. Unless an outsider who knows him goes in and lives among them as a missionary, as a business owner, doing business, which is what God is using these days in closed countries, for-profit business in other countries to expand the gospel. That's a whole nother subject we'll talk about somewhere downstream. But important stuff to know. So the commission was to go, and the reality of it is, though, over time, God has sovereignly brought, particularly to our country, people from around the world to relocate here among us. And so many of the neighbors that we now have, and it's disturbing to some American Christians that, hey, we've got all these people here that aren't Americans. How a Bible-believing person can navigate that way, I'm not really sure. But clearly, as in the Old Testament, when the stranger foreigner comes and lives among you, you treat them. You bless them. You treat them because you were strangers and foreigners. And what I've learned over the years working with refugees and having to defend my work with refugees from attacked things in a newspaper in Phoenix was, hey, you know what? My Lord was a refugee. And I'm glad Egypt didn't enforce their immigration laws when Joseph and Mary had to flee with the baby Jesus. He fled into Egypt, and he lived there with his parents as a refugee until it was time and safe for them to move back to their own land. So our story of God's people is refugee status. That's the story of Jesus and his family. So controversial subjects for some. I don't think so for this group because I know Phil, but and Carlos. But really important stuff to know. So here's how we navigate then. The way we navigate is God is sovereign. There are no accidents. And perhaps he's bringing the nations into our neighborhoods because he loves them. And in their country, they'd have no exposure to people that know him and have the truth and live according to the truth. Perhaps he brought them into our neighborhoods for that. And we don't need to worry about their immigration status. If they're in our path, he's called us to serve them. and to be Jesus to them. And so that's what we're going to do. And so when you look at the changing demographics, particularly in our country, we have the most refugees or immigrants from other countries than any other country in the world. Now, not as a percentage of population. That's actually Canada. Canada has percentage of population, many more internationals than we do, but we have the largest, most diverse number in this country. And so one of the things we want to do, besides reaching our local community, who's ever in our local community, meeting needs as we be salt and light, is we want to particularly be sensitive to immigrants that have come in here. So I want to kind of talk about a few of the categories of immigrants. And again, I worked with refugees in overseas. I spent a lot of time in refugee camps in Thailand with refugees from Myanmar, Burma, training pastors who were refugees living in camps in Thailand, Tibetan refugees in Nepal who were in refugee camps outside of Pokhara, Nepal, if you've ever been to Nepal. And so I had experience with refugees in outside the U.S. context over the years with all the missionaries that we've sent, people I've done, training I've done, cross-cultural team trips and so forth. But a door opened for me a while back to pastor a church in Phoenix. It's a long story, but to move to Phoenix and take over a small Southern Baptist church as the pastor, which was heavily immersed in refugees. It was down to about a dozen senior citizens in that church. It had shrunk from its heyday in the 70s, and now they had 100 refugees from Burma who were Christians meeting in their church. And I had done ministry to some of them in Thailand in a refugee camp. And so they called and said, "Oh, Pastor Jeff, we're living in Phoenix now. Can you come to Phoenix?" I was on staff with John Michaels at the time in Vegas. And they said, "Can you come and speak to our church?" And I went and spoke to their church. And then the pastor said, "Hey, why don't you speak to my congregation? And by the way, I've been here 40 years, and I've been praying. I think God wants you to take over my church." So I became a Southern Baptist and took over a church. Totally now immersed in the refugee experience, not in a transitional state, because in Nepal and Thailand, those refugees are not in their own country. They're in a country that doesn't really want them there. They're being hosted there. They're not liked. And they're waiting to be resettled through the IOM, the International Office of Management, which is the UN's arm for refugee resettlement globally. International Office of Migration, IOM. And so I got there. I started working with the 3 refugee resettlement agencies that work in Phoenix: International Rescue Committee, Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services. There are 9 nonprofits that contract with the U.S. State Department to resettle refugees. The government decides how many refugees we're going to accept a year. Usually in the past, till Trump, the number was between 80 to 90,000 refugees were resettled here. Those refugees were resettled through nonprofits, the 9 that the State Department contracts with. A couple of them work here in San Diego. International Rescue Committee's here. I think Catholic Charities is here. I think there's the Jewish one operates here. Yeah, Jewish World Services and so forth. But I got immersed in refugee ministry from the angle of these people are given a new start, a new life. And when I train people to minister to refugees, I do a little exercise. You have 10 minutes to flee your house with one bag, and you're never going to return to your house the rest of your life. What do you take? What does that feel like? What process do you have to go through? And so anyway, started doing ministry to refugees, learning about this and that. Through that, was exposed to the whole refugee resettled experience and have been involved over the years with that kind of ministry a lot. But in that process, I had already had some experience with illegals here in San Diego. When I was on staff with Pat back in the day, there were, illegal people from Mexico and Central America living in the tomato fields in Carlsbad. And me and a guy from Colombia that was in our church and a couple other guys, we found a bagel shop that would donate their used bagels. We had our wives make soup, and we went out to the Carlsbad tomato fields on Sunday morning and gave out food and soup and preached the gospel to them, discipling them, knowing that if we preach the gospel to them and save them, when they get caught by immigration and sent back home, we just sent missionaries back. And some of them were from unreached people groups. They were the indigenous people in Mexico, but they're here, and so we're loving on them. So I was able to have that experience and hear that story and knowing, hey, they're working and it's fascinating because they're working, they're sending money home. I don't know how many of you had jury duty, but I've had jury duty. I've been on 5 different cases. One of my jury duties that I served on was a Border Patrol agent stealing from the people in the fields in Carlsbad the day they got paid in cash. The owners of the fields were paying them in cash. The day they got paid, this Border Patrol agent was nailing them and taking their money. And I was on a jury that found him guilty. I mean, but the point is, look, they're here not because they dream of living in Mexico. Most of them, they're here because it's very difficult where they're at to take care of their friends and family. And there's all other factors, which I'm not here to talk about that. But the point of it is so there are people here from other countries that got here illegally, but they came for reasons that if you were in their same context in their country, you'd probably be here too. Don't think you're above making those kind of decisions. If you had the right circumstances in your life, the lack of hopelessness, your wife, your kids, you would be making similar decisions. So we have to be very careful in the way we analyze them. But so they come as illegal immigrants. There are people that come as legal immigrants. They've come on visas, work visas or whatever. They're here too. Normally, they're working for an international company. So you've got illegal immigrants who come here. Most of them don't speak English. Then you have legal immigrants who, if they're being offered a job here, they come with English sufficiency, or the company wouldn't be bringing them to America, but they're here. They're away from their people. They're away from their culture. They're away from, everything that's familiar and comfortable, and they're in our context. So immigrants that are legal, that are here as part of our workforce, that come with language skills. You then have, like this brother here from Bangladesh, you have people who have come here as international students. They are from their countries. Usually they meet a certain proficiency in English, and they come from all countries around the world, and they come here to go to school. We're still, as crazy as it sounds, we're still the #1 destination where people want to come and go to school here. That's changing, but we're still that right now. And so there's international students. And then, of course, you have refugees. A couple things about refugees, and some of this I'm going to rehash later on when we're ready to engage. But refugees, the basic idea of a refugee is a refugee is somebody who has had to flee where they live because of persecution, where it's costly, too costly for them to stay where they're at. It could be religious persecution, could be political persecution, it could be gender-based persecution, if you know what I mean. It could be, for whatever reason, they have fled from the place that they call home. If they flee and they stay in their own country, like in Ukraine, people that fled from the east parts of Ukraine, Donetsk and those places, and they stay in Ukraine, they're refugees, but they're called IDPs, internally displaced persons. They're IDP, they're refugees, but they're still in their country, they're just not home. They generally speak the language of the people that are still there, where they're living now in that country. And then a refugee, as we know it, is they now cross the border, and they're in a country that's not their own. Usually that country doesn't want them there. They tolerate them, they try to take care of them, but it's only temporary. And then they try to get into the UN system through the IOM, get validated as a refugee, and then they're put on a wait list, which takes usually about 12 years to be resettled, because up until the war, there were only about 150,000 refugees with legal resettlement papers per year. 150,000 people a year declared refugees, validated by the UN, get resettled. And prior to Trump, that number of 150,000, about 80,000 of them came to America. Next was Canada. And next was, then you get into other countries who take 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. We take the bulk of them because of the way our country was structured and a lot of other reasons. So that's probably more than you wanted to know about that kind of stuff. But the point of it is for this, and I'm going to stitch this all together for you here in a second, is that there are people from around the world in our neighborhood by God's design. So you must navigate, regardless of how they got here. You have to navigate from the fact that they're here and God permitted them to be in the sphere of our lives because He loves them enough to have brought them in contact with you. He knows that He's blessed you, and you know that you've been blessed to be a blessing. So the mindset and the framework is absolutely crucial. And it's fascinating to me, the whole idea of the Gibeonites in the Old Testament, where they totally scammed Joshua and made it sound like they were from a faraway people. And then once Joshua made a commitment to accept them, he found out later, oh, they were part of the people we're supposed to conquer. He couldn't conquer them. God wouldn't let him. The Gibeonites became an important part of the history of the nation of Israel. They scammed the leadership of Israel at the time, and God made them honor that. And what's fascinating is the long day of Joshua, where God extended the day, it was because of non-Jews. They were fighting that war where God extended the days to protect the Gibeonites because they had made a commitment to them. Interesting. Okay? So, immigrants, international students, refugees. A couple of things about particularly international students and refugees. 92, I think the last time I saw, 92% of international students, and Mahmoud, you could probably speak to this, never go inside the home of an American while they're here. 92% of international students are here, living among us, going to our schools and universities, speak enough English to be here, and they never get invited to the home of anybody in the community. They hang out with other international students. They hang out with other internationals in whatever city that they're in. They never get invited. It's just crazy, right? The nations are in our neighborhoods, and there's no language barrier because they're international students, but we are not engaging them, knowing that they're Muslims, Hindus, from countries, and if they're here, they probably come from wealthy families if they're able to go to school here. So to bring them to Jesus here, you're going to influence a country downstream when they finish after 3 or 4 years with their degrees and they go home. You've sent back somebody in a position of power and influence that can influence a country. I've seen that happen through an international student ministry at Arizona State in Phoenix. So that opportunity. And then refugees. And refugees are the hardest to work with by far because they don't speak English. Some of the refugees that I ministered to in Phoenix, they'd never been in a car, a vehicle, until the day they were driven from the camp to the airport. I would go in as they were put in their apartments. I would go in, members of my church, teach them how to turn on a light. Wow. Light. Look at that. I'm not joking. And they're in trauma, so they live as in a little cluster in the living room of the apartment. They don't know how to use the stove. They don't know how to use the sink. I mean, it's like unbelievable. If you want to see a great movie, a documentary on this, it's called God Grew Tired of Us. Nicole Kidman narrates it. God grew tired of us, talking about the lost boys of Sudan. And they track 3 lost boys that come over as refugees for like a 3 or 4 year period, and their experience here in America as refugees. I used to use that as part of my training. I'll probably use that as part of the training here later on. But that context of refugees, very difficult to work with. They are the ones who demand the most. They are the most difficult to work with because they're the greatest in need as they come, and they don't have language skills. So we're going to talk about more of this, but basically there's a lot of different things that I'll be doing over the next couple of months that I might invite some of you to participate in and doing research to find out which ethnic groups are here, which languages. You can get a lot of info from the net. What's the ethnic breakdown at local public schools? They'll tell you. It's got numbers. 60% of the students are Hispanic, 10% are Pacific Islanders, blah, blah, blah. And so, but what's the point? The point of it is we're on a mission from the missionary God, and we're not only engaged in reaching the globe, we are engaged in saying, Lord, you brought the nations into our neighborhoods, and we can participate in the Great Commission of making disciples from every ethnic group in our own yards, in our own community. What a privilege. We don't neglect, you still need people to go to Bangladesh. Most Bangladeshis are still in Bangladesh. And I know some people from another Calvary that are there doing translation in Bangladesh and working among other people groups. So you still got to have the planes with the pilots, but those aircraft carriers, they don't just have planes for long away stuff. They have armaments for anybody that comes close to the ship. And the crew members are trained for close-up engagement. And so we want to have that mindset and that approach. So there's going to be some ideas that I'm going to be giving from you, some research that we'll be doing. And one of the things that's important to understand is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Phil and I have talked about this. I saw this in Phoenix. People want to come in and start ministries. There's already ministries doing this stuff. Let's research what's already going on. Let's see how we can join what's already being done. And even if it's a secular, non-Christian organization, hey, what if you as a Christian joined them and started doing it side by side? Our ESL program we ran in Phoenix at this apartment complex, which was 98% refugees, owned by a couple from Croatia, who the husband came to the Lord while I was there. He was an atheist, came over from Yugoslavia back in the day. They had people from 12 different countries speaking 14 different languages in this apartment complex. We started an English program there. You would be surprised how many students I got from ASU, Arizona State students that heard about what we were doing, non-believers. But this younger generation is kind of noble and want to pick up the cause and social justice, and they would come and say, hey, we hear you're teaching English. Yeah, we are. You want to come and experience it? Yeah, and then you get into relationships and you start sharing, well, why are you doing this? Because we love Jesus. And our God tells us we're to welcome the stranger and the foreigner and to equip them and treat them as if they're part of us and help them get going. It was amazing opportunities. So there may be secular, non-religious, non-Christian organizations that are doing really good work that we'll just join them. Put a little salt and light into what they're already doing. And as you serve with them side by side, there will be opportunities to explain why you're doing it. So that's the kind of stuff that's going to be coming downstream. So I think I don't want to get too far in depth, but part of what we're going to do is there's going to be a period of research. We got to know the lay of the land. We have to, we got to survey the land like the 12 spies, right? Find out who's there, who's doing what, where are the needs. We also want to find out, and I'll just plant the seed in you now, one of the things that I've found to be most effective is find people's, what's your vocational background? What have you done for work that could be helpful to serve other people? What's your educational background? Here's one that we've learned with the Filipino church because they love fishing. Do you have a hobby or something? We have used their love for fishing off the Imperial Beach Pier as an on-ramp to starting a Bible study and seeing 4 women come to the Lord at a Bible study because we delivered free fish to senior Filipino citizens that don't have living on Social Security. So you get to exercise your fun of fishing, and that provides an on-ramp for an open door to pass on those fish and bless them. but build a relationship that's meaningful to share the Lord with them. You see? So one of there's a good friend of mine, again, Phil knows him, Carlos knows a guy named Ed Compion, who now pastors Calvary in Morro Bay. It's called Calvary Shoreline in Morro Bay. Ed's an old friend, was crucial when we started Shepherd Staff. Spent 10 years in Kenya. Prior to that, 2 years at the training center in Tijuana that Calvary Spring Valley runs. Ed shared this with me one time at a missions conference in Philly when we were there, Carlos was at Philly, and he coined this, and I'm like, dude, I'm going to steal that, and I'm going to beat it to death. He said, listen, with this kind of ministry, he goes, we got to expose people, and we expose them in order for them to engage. But it's not enough to engage. This kind of ministry requires entanglement. When you start working with immigrants, we're going to expose you to people that are outside of your sphere of day-to-day life. We're going to provide on-ramps to engage. But once you engage, your life is going to become entangled with theirs where you love them. You care about them. When it's 2 o'clock in the morning and their kid is sick and they don't know what to do or how the system works, they're going to call you. Expose, engage, and entangle. Because that's kind of like what your Lord did. He engaged, and his life became entangled with a group of people that he was putting his life into. So we'll use that kind of approach. Okay? So, I think that's enough for now. I don't want to overload you. Questions? Any questions that I can answer based on anything that I've said today? Anything crop up in your mind? Yes. Right. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
The microphone. Carlos, what did you do? Okay.
So, did you guys hear what she said? Okay.
I really loved the analogy of the church being salt and how you use this, you said how salt, it just disinfects and it deals with just really corruption.
Yes.
Just like the fish, how you talked about the fish and the light and us being the light and how the light helps us to properly engage with one another. I think that was just a diamond.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, and going along with that, like I said, I kind of knew that before I went to the Philippines, but the idea of salt, not when Jesus says you're the salt, again, in the context of the day, salt was crucial to life. It wasn't for flavoring food primarily. Without salt that was salty, it had to be different from what you placed it into. And what you placed it into, it stopped the putrefaction process. It stopped corruption long enough so that it could be useful. So when I saw them kill those fish and cut them open and then rub that salt in there and then lay them on the road, the Japanese came in where they built all these really nice roads. They didn't ask the Filipinos what they needed. So they just said, we're going to build you really nice roads. So they built these really nice roads that are now covered with drying coconut and drying fish. Nobody's driving on them. They still drive on all the old routes, bang, 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 bang. But man, that asphalt is perfect for drying things in the sun. Like the classic example of, we're going to help you, but we're not going to ask you what you really need. So, yeah, go ahead, brother.
Yeah, I just want to talk about my experience as an international student. When I first came, first few years, Christmas and Thanksgiving was difficult because the campus was closed, and I was living on campus. So our dorm was open, so I get to go to just stay there, but no one was there, you know. And one of the campus that dorm I was living in, they had a kitchen. Actually, you can just cook your own food. So I was just doing that, and a few of my friends. So I understand that, like, the isolation, like, you know, when
Yes.
especially those times, because when everyone is gone. So I think there is a great opportunity for us to engage with those students. And one example I'll give is there is a person I follow. He's from Saudi Arabia. His name is Al Fadi, and he came as a student also, and one of the Christian family took him in, basically, especially during the Christmas time when he didn't have any place to go, and he engaged with them and basically showed him love. And later, 10 years after, when he was going through his, whatever he's going through, he reached out to this family and re-engaged with them because that's the only people he knew. And throughout the whole process, he came to Christ.
Yes.
And so someone from Saudi Arabia coming to Christ is a very big deal. And because he speaks fluent Arabic, you know, now he's evangelizing basically online because he cannot go back to his country anymore.
Yes.
But he's engaging with them. He has his own channel. He has thousands of followers so a lot of underground churches are built in Saudi Arabia.
Amen.
Because of what he's doing.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, so again, there'll be more specifics and more on-ramps, and it's not either or. It's not one of these things. This church is large enough. We have a large enough base of people here with a lot of backgrounds that all these things may be ongoing. But I just appreciate your prayer as there's some surveying that's going on over the next few months, and getting a handle, and then just be thinking along those lines of, you know, what life inventory you have that might be a connection point to connect with people, serve them, and build a meaningful relationship. Because that's the key. The idea of you're just going to go in, you're going to preach the gospel, they're going to surrender to Jesus, it's just not realistic in most cases with people from other countries and other cultures. Culturally, they're going to agree with whatever you say. You want to accept Jesus? Yeah. Because culturally, it's rude, and it would be shameful for them to disagree with you, especially if you're part of the host country where they now live. But their willingness to pray that prayer with you, which maybe you just met them, is not necessarily an indication that a spiritual act was taking place. It might be, but you have to be very cautious. And you learn these things as you do this kind of ministry. But meaningful relationships are absolutely crucial. So, so that's kind of a bit of where we're at and where I see us going. And again, Phil and I talked like 6 years ago, whatever it was, first in Budapest, and then one time when he was here, about, you know, what does a healthy local church look like in the lives of its own members, in its community, and globally. And let's build a church that can, you know, be a prototype, that can say, hey, and provides community. And so there will be things. Again, our culture is changing, as you know. Our context is changing in this country. And so in that, then, the sense of community, of service, of we're on a mission from God, we're going to become more and more in contrast with the surrounding culture. And let me close with this one little analogy, because I was asked by Lutheran Social Services in Phoenix to put together a training course for newly arrived refugees. One is on parenting in America, and the other is on understanding American culture. And like, how can you do that with a translator in a 1-hour session? But I tried. But one of the key things that I tried to explain to them is, like, look, where you're from in your country, the cultural values that you're teaching your kids in your house, the cultural values, they're probably religious values too, but for sure cultural values. When your kids go out the front door, those cultural values are being reinforced. in the community, by the school, by the merchants, by the people in the neighborhood. The culture within your home, when your kids are outside of your home, honor for elders, authority, respect for authority, sensitivity to honor shame issues, acknowledging your grandparents, seeing yourself as not an individual but the child of your parents, the grandchild of your grandparents, your cousins, extended families, all of those things. In your country, when you go outside your front door, all of those cultural traits are being reinforced in the larger community. You're in America now. And all of those cultural traits that you value when your kids go out the front door, they're being taught the opposite. The opposite is being modeled at the school, by the teachers, by the curriculum, by the way we live here in America. So you have to understand that the larger culture that is life in America, where time is highly valued and the event is not so highly valued, but time is, individuality, standing out from the group is honored rather than being part of the group is where honor is found. All of those things your kids are going to be exposed to. So you have to understand what it takes to survive here in that context and recognize that it's going to be a challenge for you because you're an adult and you were raised with those cultural values. You got to understand your kids are being shaped and molded by this culture, and it's very different. And so first, I just had counseling last week with an immigrant family, first to second generation conflict. You're born and raised in your country, you're now raising your kids here, your kids are completely gone off the rails according to your cultural values, but they're the cultural values of America. And now there's tension in the family. You can't get out of it, but you need to understand it and have tools to deal with it. So we'll talk about some of that too. So that's enough. My throat's on the verge of rebellion. So let me pray and then, okay, Father, thank you for this day. Lord, I really believe you have here exactly who you wanted to have here. No coincidences. And Lord, I thank you for the leadership with Phil and Carlos and Joy and just the team that's here, the cross-cultural living experience that's here, Lord. This church, Lord, has exactly the inventory you want them to have at this moment in time, not only for their own members, but for this community and the world. And we want to be good stewards of that. So give us the grace we need to do that for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
Can we, I just have a couple things to say. Can we thank Jeff? That's one of them. This was so good. Was this great or what? Is your brain exploded a little bit? Good. One more thought, or just a couple more things. We're here at Calvary San Diego, we're really investing in like what we're going to call like a holistic approach to mission. In other words, we're not just going to the savages. We are the savages. Does that make sense? We're not going to savages. That's called colonialism. It failed. It succeeded in some ways, but it's failed. Now, we're the savages going to savages. Does that make sense? That's the gospel, like broken people reaching other broken people, but who have been born. So much of what like Jeff was saying there about like our approach at the end there, it's so important that we're not trying to fish in the big pond of where everybody's successful and doing great and we're trying to keep up with the Joneses of outreach. Like we're going to do this crusade and this big thing. We want to reach let's just reach broken people. They're the most open to the gospel, the least reached, and nobody else is fishing there. I don't have the skills to fish in the pond where everybody's fishing. I got to go where I might have a chance, right? And that's where nobody else is. So we as a church are really interested in being where others are not, because that's mission. And then where everybody else is, let's cheer them on. Like I'm stoked that others are doing those things. I just don't want to have to do what they're already in that sense. Now, we want to go and jump into ministries that already exist in our community to help out. There's so many areas. So when I say we don't want to jump into those things, I mean I ain't going to start, I'm not the next Greg Laurie to do a harvest crusade. I don't have any interest in those things. I want to go jump in with the IRC and help out teaching English, which is what we've done before COVID, to kids, to students who are freshly here from Afghanistan or Syria. Let's go teach them English. We have one asset that the world really wants, English. I couldn't teach it, but I mean, that kid doesn't know the difference, so I can do my best, you know? I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, I mean, I can, you know. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, let's use, like, I mean, we're really blessed to live in San Diego, where the world is here, and we get to be a part of that. And so I'm really excited about that. You know, in my area of cultural anthropology, we say it's not about absorption, it's about adaptation. And you think of like, we're not absorbing each other's cultures, but I'm adapting and you're adapting. And we want to help. There's such huge opportunity in our community in helping people adapt to this world. Not making them like us, but just giving them the tools to be able to succeed. And those open doors that's going to give is going to be incredible. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I was moved by hearing Mahmoud. I was sad, a student Mahmoud, you know, at Christmas time by himself. Somebody hugged my brother here. No, you know, but it's true. I mean, how many people are in that situation, you know? And so how could God use us? It's exciting. Our big vision as we're working towards this is like, we're gonna start with research. We're gonna start with some better kind of focalized training. We're gonna start reaching out. And our big picture goal is to have here on Calvary San Diego campus our own like school of mission and like missional formation where we can help people grow as disciples of Jesus Christ, with the main center being the mission of God and his purposes in the world. And so we're hoping to like, that's our big picture. Like, if you want to know where we're going in that part of the sphere of the church, that's where we're going. But that doesn't happen in months, maybe not even in a year, but we're going to move in that direction. And I think we, as the people that were here today, we get to be a part of that from the foundation. So that's pretty exciting. So let's thank Jeff again, and then you guys have a great rest of your day, okay? Thanks, Jeff.